Welcome all. Thanks for joining us for another San Mateo County Libraries program. And most importantly, welcome Kendal. Please take it away.
Hi there, everybody. So like I said, I am Kendal, and that was a great introduction from Darren. So thank you so much. Bees are one of my favorite critters. They were kind of the cornerstone founding critter for my Sager family farm. So I do a lot of education with bees. I'm also in the Master Beekeeper program at UC Davis. So you may have heard of things like Master Gardeners. There's also a Master Beekeeper program. So I do consider myself extremely knowledgeable about the bees, and I have been a beekeeper for now just about 11 years. So, and every year I still learn new things. There's always something to learn about. So if you have a question, this is honestly, questions are one of the things that help me learn more about bees. So there is definitely, if you have any question, I would love to hear it, because even kindergartners help me learn new things about bees, because they will ask certain things about bees and they'll be like, well, how do they select a new queen bee? And I'm like, well, they'll feed this one special stuff. Like, why did they select that egg? And there are research papers about why bees select certain eggs to become queens. So your questions help me out too. Without further ado, let's get into our program. So today I'm going to talk about the buzz on beekeeping. So how to start up a backyard hive. So I'm going to go over a general overview. And so hopefully if you're considering beekeeping, this should help you determine if you want a hive in your backyard. If you already have a hive, this will hopefully also give you some more information about your bees, because I'll go over some bee basics. And it should be really good in general. Even if you're not considering keeping a beehive, then we are also going to just be talking about some really cool facts about bees and how beekeepers take care of them. So I think it's good overall for anyone who wants to know stuff about bees. So let's start out with, why would you want to keep bees? So I'll go over why do you want to keep bees, and then I'll go over some bee basics. So we'll talk about the bees, and then I'll go into the logistics. So I know a lot of people who are considering keeping bees probably have some logistic questions. So I'll leave at the end. I'm going to go through how much time does this hobby take? How much does it cost? Those sort of things. Where do I get more resources? So I definitely have a lot of resources, both that I post on YouTube and just local resources in San Mateo County. There are plenty. So I'll go over a lot of those logistics at the end. And if you have a question at any time, feel free to chime in, pop it in the chat. And then at the end, we should have a lot more time for just free form questions. So let's take a look. I've got some pictures of stuff. I'll start with why keep bees. So we'll start out with, why should I keep bees? And let's see, oops, just start my presentation. There we go, oh, present button right over there. So why should I keep bees? And I'm actually going to do the reverse of this question, is like, why not keep bees? And a lot of people think, oh my gosh, there's a pointy end to this critter.
I apologize for interrupting, Kendal, but it does look like there's something in the middle of the screen and off to the right that's blocking our view of this slide.
Let's see, is it this thing? You can see this?
It is that
toolbar, or?
Yep, that's correct. And then also maybe the...
I wasn't sure you guys could see that toolbar. There it is in the bottom.
And then also on the right, I think the videos of us.
Oh, you guys can see my entire screen, huh?
Well, we don't get to see it. It's blacked out just a little bit, but but very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for letting me know that. So I'll go back to, this is some of the reasons why you might not want to keep bees, is there's a pointy end to this critter. And I think a lot of people associate all flying, stinging insects with bees. And everything on my screen right now is not a bee. So these are not bees. These are hornets, wasps, yellow jackets, and they are definitely different than honeybees. So honeybees, these cute fuzzy little critters, and then we've got our wasps, yellow jackets, and they're actually really different. Yellow jackets in particular they are omnivores. They eat pretty much anything. So if you're eating a meal outside and there's a bug buzzing around you, or it's eating your, let's say a tuna fish sandwich. So it eats your tuna fish sandwich. Honeybees are vegetarians and they only eat nectar and pollen from flowers. So if what you're eating is close to nectar, maybe a honeybee would be interested. So something very sweet. Sometimes they'll suck up the sweet juice from a watermelon on a hot day. But in general, the main pest that bothers you at a picnic table is not a honeybee. It's usually a yellow jacket or a wasp. And yellow jackets and wasps actually eat honeybees. So I'm not too much of a fan of them around my hives. They have their place in the ecosystem, but not all flying stinging insects are bees. Bees do sting, but they really don't want to sting you. After a bee stings, she dies. So it's not in her best interest to sting you. And actually, they have a lot of the same warning signs that other critters do when they don't want to be bothered. So as a beekeeper, if I'm near my hives, I'm doing my best to be really calm and not wave my arms, because honeybees are very small and I'm very big. And if I walk up to their house where all of their babies are and I'm waving my arms, they start to view me as a threat. And that's when I might get stung, is because they're saying, hey, we're trying to protect our babies, our queen bee, everything that's inside of our hive. And this big animal is attacking us. And so I'm going to sting it. And even though I die, I'm trying to protect my family. So that's when I might get stung, is if I'm waving my arms wildly and kind of introducing myself as a threat to the beehive. The other thing is they usually give me a warning sign in that they will tap my face. So I'm wearing a veil and they'll actually tap me in the face because they can smell my breath. So they know where my face is. And that tapping, they're not trying to sting me yet, but they're trying to tell me to back away from their hive. So this is sort of like a cat hissing. So if a cat's hissing at me, I'm not going to go and pet it. Same thing with the bees. If they're tapping me, I try to wrap up what I'm doing and back away, because they're telling me, we're not liking what you're doing. Please back away, creature, or we're going to sting you. So stinging is really the last resort for the bees. So if you can remain calm and listen to the signals that they're giving you, stinging is more of a minimal risk. So let's now veer back into why keep bees. And there are so many reasons to keep bees. First of which I think pops into a lot of people's head, is honey. So people are like, oh, I want honey from my bees. And this is a 1 pound jar of honey. And from one single beehive, I can actually get about 100 of these jars every year. So that's from one single beehive. So you get a lot of honey. But there's also a lot of other cool things that you can get. And let's see if I can share my screen again, and hopefully you guys can see everything this time. But let's go on to bee products. So I already talked about honey, but there's also things like royal jelly, pollen, beeswax, and even propolis. So from beeswax, you can be making candles, lip balms, salves. You've probably seen a lot of these like Burt's Bees products, but some of the more rare ones, so pollen, pollen is definitely getting more popular. You can buy a jar of pollen at a place like Whole Foods now, and people use this as a nutritional supplement, and you can actually collect this from your own bees. It's not that tricky to do. And you can add this into your yogurt, into your smoothie. It tastes honestly like the texture of powdered sugar, and but it tastes like a flower. So I think it's a very interesting thing to collect. And then royal jelly. This one is actually rather difficult to collect. So if you've seen expensive royal jelly, this is basically the milk of the beehive. So you can see over on the right side, you can see these little larvae sitting in these white pools of royal jelly. So this is a substance that's created by the bees, and it's fed to the young in the beehive, which is why it's kind of like the milk of the beehive. So made by the young females and given to the babies. And this is very, very nutritious, and it's very hard to collect. So where I'm looking at honey at about 100 pounds per hive. This I would measure more in like grams of how much I could get out of a beehive. But it is one of the products that comes straight from the beehive. And then propolis. So propolis is something that a lot of people don't know that bees collect. They collect botanical resins. So you can kind of see it with this bee here. And there's this kind of edge of sticky, gooey stuff. So it's sort of like sap, and they use it as an antimicrobial. So humans can actually collect this and make their own tinctures. And you can also actually even put this in clear varnishes and use it as a stain. So up at the top, I've got a picture of a violin, and that's because Stradivarius violins were historically varnished in propolis varnish. So this is pretty cool. And this is also a thing that's pretty easy to collect. So you can definitely do this on your own. So, oops, got a new screen share. So one of the other things that we're getting not directly from the hive is pollination. And this is something that Whole Foods put out, is the picture of their produce section before and after pollinators. So this is their section that as it is today. And if you took away pollinators, this is what their produce section looks like. So this is not, I guess, 100% accurate in that everything would completely disappear without honeybees, but those are all plants that are pollinated at least in some capacity by bees. So it was like a lot of your apples, onions, berries, a lot of those things would not be as productive without bees. So if you've got some backyard sort of produce going, bees are definitely helpful. So I definitely see bees on a lot more bees now that I have beehives. I see them on a lot of my fruit trees, especially. They love that, but they're also on all of my other stuff. And it sounds like there's a cool program coming up about how to make pollinator gardens. And then one of the other reasons that I just love keeping bees is they are just so cool. Like, I love looking at bees. And honestly, I kind of refer to it as bee TV. So what we're looking at right now is a observation hive, and these come in various shapes, but it's basically a glass wall on one of your hives, and you can look in. And they are just so neat to watch working and inspect inside. So that is honestly one of my favorite reasons to keep the bees, is because they're just really interesting to learn about. So now with that, now that you're like, yes, I would like to keep some bees because there are so many great reasons to keep bees, I'll go a little bit more into some bee basics. So just to kind of lay a foundation of what are the bees doing? I see a lot of bees, but what are they really up to inside of their hive? So now let's take a look. I'll go back to the share. And so our bee basics. So typically, I'd say when we see bees out and about, and my video I think is still loading, but when we see bees out and about, and if my videos aren't working, then I can also skip them. But usually when I see bees, they are collecting something from flowers. So hopefully we can all see this now, is this little bee is going from flower to flower, and she's sticking her face in. And this bee is a forager. So that's one of the jobs that a worker bee can have. And she is collecting nectar. So the bees are out and about. So the bees that we typically see are worker bees, and they're out collecting food. So we don't get to see most of the bees' life because we basically just get to see their shopping trips. So that's what we're usually seeing when we're looking at the bees outside. You'll also see them collecting pollen, and they have little pollen sacs on their back legs. So you'll see a colorful back leg on your bee because they're collecting pollen. So let's go back and, whoops, let's go to the next slide, actually. There we go. So we were looking at worker bees, but inside, there are actually 3 castes of bees. So these are 3 different categories of bee. So they're all honeybees and they're all actually related to each other, but they all have different jobs inside of the hive. So the worker bee, the drone bee, and the queen are the three castes. And I'd say the bee of most interest to most people, they're like, oh, I want to know about the queen bee. So the queen bee is what most would consider to be the largest bee in the hive, but it's really her abdomen. So it's her tummy. And that's because this bee is the mother bee of the entire beehive. So in here, here we're looking at these little white lines inside of these holes. Those are bee eggs. And this is that queen bee's entire job is she goes from hole to hole inside of the comb, laying eggs. And she is so good at this, she can lay up to 2,000 eggs a day. So every day she can make 2,000 new bees. So that is a lot of bees. So when these little eggs hatch, they hatch into a larva. So their life cycle is actually very much like a butterfly. So they start as an egg, turn into a larva, and then they go into a cocoon. And so that's all that the queen is doing, is she is the reproductive center of the hive. So now we come to the worker bee. The worker bees are the ones that actually take care of all those babies. So this is the bee that we saw out on the flowers. This is also the bee that is taking care of all the young. The worker is a great name for this because these bees are doing all of the work inside and outside of the hive. So this is an example of the bees bringing in food. So these worker bees are bringing in pollen. So all of these multicolored holes, so we've got some orange, some red, some purple, that's all pollen. Different plant species produce different colors of pollen. So I think Echium is just about to be in bloom or is in bloom in some parts of the Bay Area right now, has this like royal purple pollen. I think rock purslane has this bright like hot Cheeto red color. There are so many species that have the yellow and orange. Rosemary has like kind of a light greenish gray. So this diversity of pollen is they want to have this diversity. The same reason why you might not want to eat the same exact food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day is not only is it good for variety, but it is also good for their general health because they need a variety in order to maintain their own nutrition. So that's the pollen. And you might notice that it doesn't look like those little balls we looked at earlier. That's because the bees are actually making bread out of it. So they're mixing the pollen with nectar and packing it down in the hole, and they're turning it into bee bread. And the reason why they collect this is it's a protein source and they feed it to their babies. So the young babies eat this bee bread after they're done eating royal jelly. So very, very young babies eat royal jelly. The older babies eat this bee bread. The other thing, so there's this shiny liquid over here, and that is the nectar. So these worker bees are bringing in nectar, putting it in the holes either to consume or to store later when there might not be food. So that's the reason why they're making honey, is because in the winter, when there's usually not food in other climates other than the Bay Area, in the Bay Area, we have ample food all year round for these bees. So we actually get a lot more honey than other climates, but the bees are still geared to, oh, what if there is winter and we need to make honey to store that up in case it snows or it's raining. So they're going to turn that nectar into honey. So other things, and so there's,
sorry, Kendall, we just have a really good question related to the bread and the royal jelly. How do they get it into the little spaces? How are they actually
good question
transporting that?
Yeah, so they are transporting that. Let's see. Let me escape out of this. And I think I've got another slide over here. So this is how the bees are transporting the pollen. So their whole body is totally covered in hair. And then their front legs are like combs. And so they brush the pollen out of their hair and pack it onto one special hair on their back leg. And so that is how they're transporting the pollen home. And in order to get it into those little holes is they actually knock it off that hair and into the holes. So if you see freshly collected pollen, it does look like these little tiny balls inside of there. For the nectar, the bees are sucking it up with their tongue, and inside of their body, they have two stomachs. So one is like ours and digests food, and the other one is just for nectar storage. So you can think of it as a water bottle inside of the bee that is just meant to transport nectar home. And so when they get back to the beehive, they actually hand it off to a house bee. So this is another job of a worker bee, is to basically accept the groceries and go put them away. So the forager can get right back out to collecting food. So this bee, to hand it off to the other bee, regurgitates it, so spits it back out, and then the other bee sucks it up, and then she goes to one of the honeycomb cells and blah, throws it up again, and that's how it gets into the holes. So if they're making the bee bread, they regurgitate some nectar into that hole, and then they kind of pack it down with their mandibles and their legs as well. So that's how they're getting a very detailed explanation of how they get it into those little holes. So let's see, any other questions for right now before I move on? Just interrupt me if so. But I'll keep going just so there's not a blank spot. So over here, looking at the pollen, so then we saw the honey. So this honey, you notice it's not shiny on the inside, and that's because nectar is about 70–80% water, and they fan it with their wings and regurgitate it, like suck it up, spit it out over again to stir it. And they're drying out that nectar until it's only 18% water. So 70–80% water is the nectar, and then they're drying it all the way down to 18% water. And when it's perfect, they cover that hole with wax. So this is honeycomb that's perfect, filled with perfect honey and covered with wax. And the reason why they cover it up is because they are constantly drying out nectar, and they don't want to over dry the honey. So they want to keep it at that perfect 18%. So this is what that finished honey looks like. And then here are the worker bees caring for some of the young. So when you open up a beehive, there's actually a lot of people are surprised that the bees just don't fly everywhere. That's because a good percentage of those bees are taking care of babies. So those are young worker bees, and their job is to take care of their little sisters. And so you can see some of these big white fat larvae inside of those holes. The bees will stick their head in there and feed the larvae. And then they will cover up the larvae with wax when it's ready to go into a cocoon in the pupa phase. And then just like our own babies that we want to keep nice and warm, so we're in charge of keeping their temperature perfect, these worker bees are in charge of keeping the baby bees at the perfect temperature. So they actually want to be very close to human body temperature. So about like 95 degrees is where they like it. So they will actually sit on the cocoons, just like a mama hen sits on an egg. So they're sitting on the cocoons to keep them warm. During a heat spell, they'll actually fan their wings to cool the beehive down and keep it as low as 95 degrees. But if it gets really hot, so if you think of like parking your car in the sun on a hot day, if it gets really hot, they will actually even collect water and bring it into the hive, and they'll deposit water around and fan their wings to evaporate the water. So they're cooling down the beehive using evaporative cooling, just like how we sweat to cool down. That's how they're cooling down their beehive. So these worker bees are in charge of basically everything in the beehive, like temperature control. They clean the beehive. These workers are aptly named worker bees. And they are, you might have noticed I use she a lot. They're all female. So every single worker bee is a female, and they are actually up to about 60,000 bees in one beehive. So actually here's a good segue then to see my own beehives to fit 60,000 bees in there. So we're going on a little excursion out to my own beehives. So over here, I've got my beehives behind me. And this orange beehive, let's see if I can walk up even closer to it. So you can see this orange beehive is about my height. So I'm about 5 feet tall. And so this beehive is tall enough to have 60,000 bees in it. But then there's this little beehive here. This beehive is still growing for this spring. So this one only has a fraction of the height of the other one. And this one probably only has about 20,000 or so bees in it, but it will grow. Right now, there's a lot of nectar coming in. A lot of plants are blooming. And as they bring that in, their population will grow and grow. And I would expect by June, July, they'll be the size of that orange beehive. So that is the population of the beehive, is up to 60,000 bees in that beehive. So those are the worker bees. We talked about the queen bee, and you might notice those are both female bees. So that last cast of bee that we were talking about are the boys. So I'll go back to have you guys see a picture of the boys. So the boys are called drone bees. And in a beehive with one queen bee, 60,000 females, there are usually about 200 males at the height of spring. And the boys' whole job is to create babies. So these ones mate with the queen bee, and that is their only job. So these ones don't protect the beehive. They don't collect food. They can't protect the beehive because boys don't even have stingers. Only the female worker bees have stingers. Unfortunately, the female worker bees are the ones that you encounter basically everywhere because those are their jobs. So I wouldn't go around picking up bees unless you know it's a boy. And the way you can tell it's a boy is he's got huge eyes. So he has a really big body. And actually, let me go back to the picture of all three of them so you can kind of see the difference of the queen bee and the worker bee. The front two segments of their body actually look very similar, but the back segment, the abdomen, is very long because the queen bee is filled with eggs. So she has, her reproductive system is very put together, very large compared to this worker bee. I think they actually have about 180 ovaries compared to 3 to 5 in the worker bees, compared to 2 in humans. So the drone bee, his body, he looks like the football player of bees. So he's a pretty chunky guy, and those eyes are really what give him away. Because with 200 of the boy bees in the hive, you're more likely to see a boy and be like, oh, this bee is bigger. It must be the queen. But take a look at the shape of his body. You can see the abdomen is kind of short and stubby. And overall, his whole body, all of the segments look larger, and especially the eyes. So you're definitely more likely to see the male bee over there. So now I'll kind of pop into how do warrior bees. So, oops, there we go. So how do you care for your bees? And I'll pop out for just a minute, is because I use a little bit of special materials to care for my bees. So I've got my smoker here. This one's nice and shiny and new. The one that I use every day is kind of it's all sticky with propolis and other bee products. But the smoker is used to keep the bees calm. And how you use this is on the inside, you fill this part with like leaves, pine needles. I use pine needles most of the time. You start a tiny little fire, and then with the bellows, you can squeeze it and smoke will come out the tip. And before I open my beehive, I always puff in a little bit of smoke. And the reason why this keeps the bees calm is because they communicate differently than you and I. So we are speaking, so you're using your sense of hearing to interpret what I'm saying. The bees use their sense of smell. So they use pheromones to create different smells in the hive, and that's how they mainly communicate with each other. They can communicate through touch, sight, other ways, and even through hearing, but it's mostly through smell. So if there's a danger to the beehive, they produce this alarm pheromone, and it smells actually a lot like bananas. So kind of a sweet banana smell. And if this smell is emitted and circulated through the beehive, all of the bees kind of get on alert. And then they're looking for a predator. And I'm this new thing that's opening up their hive. So then they're looking for me. And then you might get stung because they want the predator to leave. But with a smoker, you puff in a few little puffs, and this covers up all the smells in the beehive. So it's kind of like going shh to the bees. So that way, if one bee gets scared by my presence and makes this smell, it's covered up by the smell of smoke. So one bee doesn't freak out 60,000 bees. So a smoker is a great thing to use. You really don't need much, just 2 little puffs is usually enough. And if I notice either the smell of bananas or that all the bees are kind of like looking at me from inside in between all of the parts of the beehive, then I usually give a little bit of a puff partway through my inspection, but usually I don't need very much. The bees remain very calm. The other thing that you'll need is some sort of protective gear. And I like to, this is, I think, the most basic form of protective gear because it's the easiest to take on and off for my presentation, is a veil. So this is the bare minimum of protecting yourself, is wearing some sort of brimmed hat with a veil over top. And this mostly is actually to keep me calm around my bees, because like I said, the bees do not inherently want to sting me. But if I start getting scared and I wave my arms, then that's when the bees are going to start getting defensive as well. So when I might get scared would be if a bee is crawling on my face or bonks into my face or is kind of in the collar of my shirt. And that's why a veil helps keep the bees away from my skin. A full bee suit would cover up my arms, and then gloves can cover up your hands as well. So for beginning beekeepers, I highly recommend wearing all of this stuff because it helps keep you really calm around the bees, because it is not a natural instinct for, if an insect is crawling on you, for you to remain really calm. And the more calm you are, the more calm the bees are. And it's not that they smell your fear, which I've heard that myth out there. It's more that my body language is extremely different when I am agitated. So if I am nervous, I start dropping things and squishing bees. And a squished bee smells terrifying to the bees because it's emitting all of her pheromones. So that's why with squished bees, they start to become more agitated. So wearing all my protective gear helps keep me calm, and I can be really careful during my inspection. And then the bees are going to remain a lot calmer as well because I'm not squishing them. So I'll take this off for now.
While
so
you're
that's
taking it
how
off, may I ask,
Yes.
do you have to watch very carefully where you step around the bees then when you're doing your inspection?
I actually, for the most part, no, because bees are typically not on the ground around the hive unless they are not long for this world. So the worker bee only lives for 6 weeks. That's it. So her first 3 weeks are inside doing household chores, and then her last 3 weeks are outside going back and forth to flowers. If any of the bees are diseased or sick, they will crawl around the floor around the outside of the hive. And this could actually be a result of the house bees, the inside worker bees, saying, you're sick and we don't want you to get the rest of the colony sick. And so they will actually remove that bee to keep the rest of the hive healthy. So that's why there might be bees on the ground. But typically with a healthy hive, you will not see a lot of bees around on the ground. So I'm not typically concentrating on where I'm stepping unless I have done something where like I shook something or dropped a bunch of bees onto the ground, then I'll be a little more conscious. But there shouldn't, for a healthy hive, be a lot of bees on the ground. So I'm more paying attention to where are my hands. Especially if you're wearing gloves, you can't feel everything. So that's more of the thing where I start looking at is when I'm grabbing something, because there are 60,000 bees crawling around in there. So wherever you put your hands, there's usually bees. So I'm usually trying to move slowly and not squish bees while I'm picking things up and putting them down is my main concentration. Great. So let's see, let's take a look at, so when I inspect the hive, what am I actually doing in there? So let me share my screen again of how to care for the bees. So during a hive inspection, I'm typically looking for these things as I'm checking for my queen. I'm checking that they have space. I'm checking that they have resources. So like the food and then their general health. So when I open my beehive, so just like I was mentioning before, so I've got a little video of what it looks like when I open the hive. So the very first thing that I do is puff a little bit of smoke in there, and then I will take off the cover of my beehive. And there's actually two covers. So this one keeps the elements out, and the beehive's still not open. There's definitely more bees on the top, but there's an inner cover. And here I'm using a hive tool to pry things apart because that propolis that I mentioned, they're gluing all these little things together. And now the hive is open, and here's where all of the bees are. So that is my open hive. So once I'm in there, the things that I'm looking for are my queen bee. So checking for a queen. There is a queen bee on this page. So I'll give you a minute so that you can look for her, and you can kind of use some of her traits from before is that she has a longer abdomen. Typically, she doesn't have as many stripes as the other bees, and her thorax, which is the middle segment of her body, is a little shinier. And that is actually mostly how I see her. So if you were looking, there she is. So there's the queen bee. And she was pretty tricky to find even on this page, but here she is. She's also on this page. So I'll give you a minute to look for her because this one is harder. And the reason why this one is harder is because she's laying an egg. So she's doing one of the things she does most often, and her abdomen is actually hidden because it's inside one of those holes. So there's my queen bee over there. So I did see her shiny thorax, but this bee is extremely hard to find because if there's 60,000 bees, and they're all walking around, and as I look at one part of the beehive and then put it back, the queen bee might be walking from part to part. So she's very hard to find. So I actually don't find her. I actually use the bee development stages to kind of figure out where she or when she was last here. So for a typical worker bee in the middle, this kind of graph shows that a worker bee is in its egg for 3 days. And then it hatches, and it's a larva for 6 days. So I can see larva around, and then capped brood, so these are the cocoons, are around for about 9 days to total up 21. So these bees, if I'm looking in my hive and I see these covered up holes, this queen bee was around 21 days ago to lay an egg that now is in a cocoon phase. If I see these big fat larvae, I know that the queen bee was around at least 9 days ago to lay the egg that then developed into this big fat larvae. But if I see eggs, so these holes all have little eggs in them. If I see eggs, I know my queen was around in the last 3 days. So really what I'm looking for instead of the queen is evidence of the queen, because if she's laying 2,000 eggs a day, there's a very good chance that I'm going to see evidence of her if she is alive and well. So I should see all 3 stages of development. And then if I don't see the queen, I'm not too worried because I know she's in there and she's doing her job. And these are a lot easier to see because they're not moving around as I'm trying to look for them. So, oh, and there's the close-up of the eggs so you can see them. They are actually smaller than a grain of rice. So it does take some training to see this. And by training, I mean, just try over and over again. If you think one of these little holes is empty, really try to examine it during your inspection and you'll end up seeing these eggs. So some people have to wear their reading glasses when they're really looking for eggs. But I think it's really neat once you are able to find them. So then The other thing I'm doing is checking for space. So in the springtime, my bees are growing. And so they're putting honey on top. So I needed to add an extra box here. So when my bees are occupying about 80% of the space inside, I will add a whole nother box for them so that they have space to bring food in. In the winter, I'm usually doing the opposite. So the bees are contracting because there's less food and it's a little colder. And so I take space away. So the beehive is a dynamic size. So when they need more space, I give it to them. And when they're not using space, I take it away. And then I'm checking for resources. So just like I was showing before, here is like a textbook great frame, because in the middle, these capped things are babies. And then they're ringed by this kind of like brownish, orangish. This is some kind of older bee bread. So the bright colors of pollen aren't quite visible there, but that's their bee bread. And then this is honey on the edges. So this is a textbook perfect frame because the worker bees want food very close to their babies, so they don't have to go far to feed them. So you should be seeing food inside of your beehive as well. And this gets really tough during the summer months. So when it gets hot and dry, that's actually the hardest time in the Bay Area, especially if we're under water restrictions for a drought, when like a lot of suburbs aren't watered. But suburban bees usually have a pretty easy time finding food, but it's always a good idea just to make sure your bees have food during your inspection. And then I'm also checking for health. So their health, this is a great looking frame. So I've got all of these capped babies. There's a few little holes here and there. And if I look in those holes, I would probably see pollen or nectar, but basically this is just like a little food stop for them. So this is what a good, healthy beehive should look like, is lots of babies, lots of food. This is what it looks like when pests move in. So if the bees weren't using this space, this little pest right here is a wax moth, and it eats pollen and makes these webs on the frame. So they actually end up destroying the wax inside of the hive. So if you have too much space, pests like wax moths will move in. This is a bottom tray underneath my beehive where there's some extra cruft, but this is a hive beetle, which can eat the honey in the hive. And these are mites. These little reddish brown, kind of shiny little things are mites that actually bite the bees and spread disease. So this is the size of the hive beetle. So you can see the bee's abdomen next to this small little beetle that eats the honey. And usually, again, if you're maintaining your space properly, you won't see a lot of these guys. This is the aftermath of the Varroa Mite. So this is one of the more common viruses. Is this bee was born with extremely shriveled wings. And this would be a bee that you would see outside on the ground around your hive, is because this one has a virus and will never ever be able to fly or be a productive member of the beehive. So those are some of the pests that you can see, and it is a whole nother like day-long presentation on how to deal with those. So I will definitely be pointing you guys at extra resources if you're interested in some of that stuff. So now I want to dive into the logistics really quick and then leave some more time for questions at the end. So I'll go quickly through some of the logistics of what kind of space do you need. So my whole backyard is only about 600 square feet. And in that backyard, I have 2 beehives, 2 sheep, and 8 chickens. So very small yard. So you actually don't need a ton of space for the bees. And I'm optimizing my space by the front of my beehive is pointed towards my fence. So when the bees take off, they actually kind of come up and over the hive. So like you saw when I was out by my hives, I can stand right next to the hive and I'm not getting covered in bees and they're not all filling my yard. So the fact that I have that fence to direct the bees up, they get up above people's heads. And so I can occupy a lot of the space in my own yard. So you actually don't need very much space at all. And let me show you guys some of the other spots where you can keep bees. So I've kept them in kind of the side yard of certain residences. If you have more space kind of on the side, as long as you don't block pathways. So I'm not pointing the entrance of my beehive right at a pathway. And then there is this little bush here. So the bees kind of have to go up and over. This is a huge yard, so you can basically put them anywhere. And I did end up building a chicken coop right here, so they had to go up and over the chicken coop. So there's a lawn directly behind that. So you can still play on the lawn and not be covered in bees. You can also do rooftop beekeeping. If you do this, you want to think about the access. I also keep bees on the roof of the Redwood City Library. And to get out there, I have to jump out a window of one of their conference rooms. So everything has to come in and out that window. So before you stick bees on your roof, think about how the bees are going to get onto the roof and how you're going to take them through your house and out that window. But it is totally possible to keep them on rooftops. There are plenty of hotels in San Francisco that actually have bees on the roof. So you want to be legal. So there are different restrictions in different areas. Every city is different. So to find out if it's legal, you can usually Google your city name municipal code, and it's searchable, and you can usually find things. So a lot of places have no restrictions, but others restrict the distance from your property line to your beehive. So obviously I don't live in an area with one of those restrictions because the bees are basically on my property line. And others say you can't keep them in your front yard. Some require that you provide water for your bees, which is you should provide water for your bees, but sometimes it's written into the law. So it's definitely the only place that I know of in the Bay Area that it's banned is Foster City. And we're working on them. But currently it's illegal to keep bees in Foster City. But in most other cities in the Bay Area, it is possible, depending on where you place your hive and how many hives you have. So let's see, let's go back to how much time do you need? So I would say in general, it takes more time than a cat, less time than a dog. Honestly, I think it's even less time than a cat, but maybe I take too good care of my cats. But bees don't require daily intervention. They do a lot of their things on their own. So they're actually a really good weekend pet. So in the winter time, you really only have to inspect your hive every 4 to 6 weeks. So if the daily high is being kind of less than 60 degrees, maybe it's a little chilly for them, but on a sunny, windless day, you'll notice that our bees are actually out foraging. And so if it is one of those sunny, windless days, I try to get out there and open up my hive and see what's happening. And I do a quick little inspection because it's chilly. And opening up their hive is like opening all the doors and windows to your house. So think about doing that in the winter. If you're wearing a jacket, the bees are likely cold as well. So I always try to make sure they're flying, but I take these quick little peeks in the winter. In the springtime, I start inspecting every 1 to 2 weeks. So that is because the bees are growing fast. With a lot of rain and a lot of warmth, you might have to add a box every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the strength of your hive. So definitely it kind of increases in the spring, but that's still a weekend chore. And an inspection really only takes about an hour for one beehive. And that's if you're doing a pretty thorough inspection. You can do quick little checks as well. So think of it about like an hour a week, which I think is less time than it takes me to take care of my cats because I have to feed them every day. So, and then in the summer, it starts to taper off. So the bees have kind of hit their maximum capacity. And I'll space it out every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how hot, how much rain there is, because the bees might be growing a lot. And then in the fall, I'm going down to every 3 to 5 weeks. And again, this kind of depends on how hot it is. You can obviously inspect more often, but you might not need to. So this is my inspection schedule. And that's because I'm an experienced beekeeper and I kind of know what to expect. For beginning beekeepers, I actually really like to encourage people to inspect every week, because then you'll kind of see what's happening inside of the beehive in different conditions. So if it's hot, if it's cold, how quickly or slowly the bees are growing, because there is a little bit of a get the feel for it sort of thing. The reason why I inspect them a little bit less than that as an experienced beekeeper is because I kind of know what they're doing. And every time I open my hive, I'm setting my bees back just a little bit because I apply the smoke, and that stops them from communicating. So that'd be like in your workplace, if you turned off everybody's email for an hour, maybe they'd get more work done, but it basically stops communication. So some of those bees might be a little held up in their jobs because they're not talking to each other. And I also break little pieces of comb that then they have to repair. So it's not a huge setback, but it's a little setback. And if I want my bees to be growing as quickly as possible, then I'm going to leave them be for as long as I think is appropriate. And then I'll check them again to make sure they have enough space. Because if they run out of space, that's a bad thing. So I definitely want to check them often enough, but not too often. I do not recommend checking bees more often than once a week, because then they might start to consider you a predator, and something that is breaking little pieces in their hive. So they're definitely not like your other domesticated animals that are like, oh, mom, you're feeding me. They're like, ah, what's this big pale bear doing opening my beehive? So I'm going to quickly, I've got a few more things and then I'll stay around for questions. But how much is this going to cost? So all of the things that you need to buy kind of add up to about $500. And this includes your suit, your tools, the beehives themselves, and the bees. So that's the startup cost. From year to year, though, you usually don't have to replace all of that. Sometimes you have to replace the bees, because our national average loss of beehives is at about 40%. So that means roughly if I had 2 beehives and playing the odds, I might only have 1 beehive the next year because one of my beehives might die out. So you might have to replace your bees, but that's about maybe $120 to replace bees. So your startup cost is about $500. Additionally, I would say the cost to extract your honey with some very fancy stuff is going to be like about $600 plus. I highly recommend joining the Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County for like $30, and then you can borrow all that stuff. So if you don't want to put a ton of money into your hobby, it's a great way to try stuff out before you buy, or you never have to buy and just keep borrowing it from year to year. And then there's unlimited extras if you want to start making beer, mead, make candles, make lip balm. You can make tons of stuff from all your beekeeping stuff. And then additional resources. So I highly, highly recommend joining the Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County. This is a beekeeping club, and even during the pandemic, they give monthly live talks. So it's a great way to learn more information. And there's a Google group that for beginning beekeepers, you can email out just about any question. You can send pictures, and experienced beekeepers will get back to you. So it's a tremendous resource if you have questions to get them answered right away, and by people who understand the local regulations and other beekeeping things that are specific to the Bay Area. You can read books. I actually love Beekeeping for Dummies. It's really great. And then there's also Les Crowder's Top Bar Beekeeping is kind of more on the more natural scale, but has a lot of great information about bees. Going online, there's tons of stuff to buy your equipment. Man Lake is one of the best places. This is like the Amazon of bee equipment. Is you can buy just about anything there, and it'll be, if you're over $100, I think it's free shipping to your house. So that is a great place to buy all of your equipment. Bee Source is if you're handy, you can actually get lots of plans. There's an online forum there. And then on my own website, I link to a lot of my YouTube videos of how to do bee inspections, month-to-month stuff. So I have actually a lot of beginner material on my website and on my YouTube channel. And shop locally, there's the Peninsula Feed Store in San Mateo. And if you want to see some of this equipment before you buy, go to the feed store, and they actually have some beekeeping equipment in the back where they keep their chicks. So if nothing else, you get to see some really cute baby chicks, as well as some bee equipment. And if you're a member of the Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County, they'll actually give you a discount as well. So that's pretty cool. So, whoops, I don't want to share more. So now, I believe that brings me to the end, and I've covered a lot of different stuff. So does anyone have any questions?
We did get just a couple of questions while you were talking, and that was awesome. You covered like just everything so well and encapsulated it so well. It was excellent.
Oh, good.
One of our participants was wondering what happens, how long do queen bees tend to live, and what happens when they pass away?
So the queen bee typically can live for up to 5 years, though I think anecdotally we've noticed that they are usually like kind of 2 to 3 year lifespan. And there is kind of like a maximum fertility for these bees, depending on when they mated. So because queen bees actually only mate for about 1 week of the entire year, and they store up all of the sperm they will ever need in their life during that week. So a queen bee would live less if she only got out to mate, or if it was rainy when she was supposed to be mating. If she runs out of sperm, the worker bees will actually stage a coup. And they say, this queen bee, she's not doing so well, so we're going to replace management. So the queen bee actually isn't in charge of the hive. The worker bees are. So it's not a monarchy, it's a democracy. So the worker bees are in control of replacing her. So if they don't like the current queen, they will actually take one of her female eggs, and when it hatches, all the babies eat royal jelly for about 3 days. And then if you're going to be a worker bee, they start eating bee bread. If they need a queen bee, they keep feeding that little baby bee royal jelly, and it will develop into a queen bee. So the worker bees can choose specifically which bees are going to be queens. So if they don't like their queen, they take one of her offspring and raise a replacement. So they will do that in the springtime. They do it for reproduction. So that's what swarming is. If you've heard about swarming, the queen bee leaves with half the hive, and about half the hive stays behind and raises a new queen. So that's how new beehives and more beehives are made. If the queen dies on accident, so if you're in there and you squish a bee and you squish the wrong bee, if you squish the queen bee, they will actually raise up an emergency queen. So the queen has a special smell. And so it's this calming, the queen is in residence smell. And if the queen is gone, the bees will realize within hours something is terribly wrong, and they will start raising a new queen bee. So as long as there are those young baby larvae in there, they can create a new queen bee by feeding those babies royal jelly, and they'll develop into queens. If there are no young bees, so if there's only cocoons in that hive, it really requires beekeeper intervention at that point, because they can't make a new queen bee. A worker bee can't be like, you know what? I've been working hard. I deserve this promotion. Her body is already physically different than a queen bee. So that development stage when she's a larvae is extremely important, because it's her reproductive system developing. So worker bees can lay eggs, but they cannot develop into worker bees. So even though they can lay eggs, they're not actually fertile. So that is the lifespan of a queen bee and how we get new ones.
Thank you. We also had somebody ask why Foster City had banned beekeeping. And maybe if you could also speak to why some cities would have different restrictions on it.
Sure. So different cities have different restrictions, and honestly, so there's a subgroup inside of the Beekeepers Guild of beekeepers who are interested in changing regulations and making them more favorable. But we find that a lot of cities look to larger cities for their regulations. So if you're looking to a larger city and they don't have any beekeeping regulations, it's like, well, I'm looking for a regulation. So they're going to look around and try to copy somebody else's. So very likely, a lot of these regulations got copy pasted from city to city and then slightly adjusted over the years. So the Beekeepers Guild, we try to work with the cities to make the restrictions appropriate for the area. So some of the restrictions don't make a lot of sense in terms of you need to be like 1,000 feet away from a public road. It's like, well, where did that come from? Why is that so? Because with adequate fencing, it probably doesn't matter. Honestly, from the front of my house, you cannot tell that there are bees in the back of my house. My neighbors actually asked me when I was moving in with the bees, weeks after I had beehives there, because the fencing really requires them to go up and out of the area. So some of these regulations are not based in fact. In Southern California, beekeeping is a lot different. They have different varieties of bees that are more defensive. So they actually require requeening your hive. So getting a brand new queen bee every few years and marking your queen bees in some cities, which we don't require up here because we don't have Africanized bees, which the media calls killer bees most often, but they're Africanized bees and we don't have that up here. So they have different regulations in Southern California than we do up here. So some of them are logic based on how beekeeping is. Foster City, we're not sure why it's illegal. As far as we can tell, it's been illegal for a very long time, but we are working on them to implement some more common sense law. So we usually say kind of adjusting flyways. So it does make sense maybe not to point your bees right at a public sidewalk, because then everyone walking on the public sidewalk is going to have to walk through bees. We also advocate for this falling into nuisance law because that would be a nuisance. So if there's no laws, it's usually nuisance law. But again, if you want to find out your local ordinances, one of the best ways is to type your city name, municipal code. And I saw there was a specific one about San Carlos. And so I looked it up and their code is not easily searchable. So when I go through and read it, there are actually regulations about chickens, bees, other things, but when I searched for keywords, it didn't come up. So I Googled beekeeping regulations in San Carlos and came up with the exact code. The other thing, Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County, there are beekeepers in pretty much every city in the Bay Area. And if you like send a question to them, there will be beekeepers there that have looked up the ordinances. So if you're not finding it, you can double check with your local bee club. Let's see.
Thank you. I know you shared a couple of books that you really appreciate. Do you have more than just those two? You said the Beekeeping for Dummies, and the other one was
let's see, I think it was Top Bar Beekeeping by Les Crowder, and that one is beekeeping in a different style, but also has some really great information. There are very few books written specifically for the Bay Area. So let me caveat your beekeeping books with many books are written by people who are in places that it snows, that have truly 4 seasons, unlike us, where we have kind of like a summer and then like a slightly cooler period of time, and then it's summer again. So I would caveat any of your beekeeping books. If they say, oh, don't open your hives until April, that doesn't apply to us. But a lot of the basic information on how to inspect your hive, what to look for in terms of problems, that's the main takeaways from books. And Darren, I will send you a list after this because I'm pretty sure we have a list of books. So let me look that up. And that's the Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County has a lot of great resources, and I know they have a book list.
Sounds great.
Yeah, let's see. Any other questions?
I believe that we got through most that were in the chat. If other people have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat down on the side. And again, Kendal, this was awesome. And you make it sound so easy.
That's great. And let me kind of say this, like, oh yeah, it's so easy. Bees are definitely kind of an in-between pet. So I think a lot of people who are interested in bees are kind of the same group of people who are interested in chickens and that sort of stuff. And it's this kind of not quite agriculture, not quite pet. So definitely with beekeeping, I kind of breezed through a lot of the diseases. So if my cat is not looking quite right, I'm going to take her into the vet. But for the bees, identifying when they don't quite look right can be a little trickier. And then additionally, I'm the vet. So it is something really worth looking into because the bee populations are declining, or at least we do lose a lot of hives every year. With honeybees, we're able to replace that by breeding them every year. So their population actually isn't plummeting towards extinction, but a lot of them die. And that is largely like still being researched, but a lot of it points towards this Varroa mite. So for beginning beekeepers, I have a lot of stuff about how to check for Varroa mites and then what to do about Varroa mites. Because keeping those in control is a really big thing. And especially with honeybees, it's something that my beekeeping practices affect all of my neighbors. So if I have an indoor cat and she's sick, she's not really going and spreading diseases because she's indoors. My honeybees have a foraging radius of up to 5 miles, so which is huge, especially if we have a lot of suburban beekeepers. So if I keep sick bees, I can spread that to other beekeepers. So it's really, if you're kind of in that I want to help bees camp, looking up the diseases and specifically Varroa mites is one of the best things that you can do. And I just saw a new question pop up down in the chat is, what are your thoughts on that bees aren't native? So it's honeybees aren't native. We actually have, in the Bay Area, we have about 400 different species of native bee. And that's actually, I think it's in California alone. We have 400 species of native bee. Most of them are solitary, so they live by themselves. So you might see those big, shiny black bees. Those are, oops, sorry, hopefully you can't hear too much. My little boy is getting hungry in the background. But those big black bees are carpenter bees. And those are actually California native bees. They're native to a lot of North America. You'll also see bumblebees. So bumblebees, they're not solitary. They live in a nest of a few hundred bees. So there are lots of different species of bee in California. My thoughts on the fact that honeybees aren't native, they are very crucial to our agriculture system. So the almond crop that is grown in Central California, it takes about 2/3 of the honeybee colonies in the United States being trucked into California to pollinate our almonds. So our agriculture system is heavily reliant on honeybee pollination because it can be moved rather quickly and human managed rather than one solitary bee. I can move 60,000 bees into a space to pollinate, and then I can move it to the next crop. So it is crucial for our agriculture system. Also, I kind of view them as a gateway bee. If people are interested in bees and they start learning about honeybees because they're like, oh, I got some honey, it kind of opens up the door to learning about all of our California natives. So while they do compete for resources. So definitely not having tons and tons of honeybee colonies displacing our natives, but I do view them as really important for educational purposes, just to get more people looking at bees. Let's see. I
actually did just, I just dropped a link in the chat to give people an opportunity to rate this event and let us know about other events you'd like to see in the future. Or you can always say you'd like to have us bring Kendal back too, and maybe speak to our kids as well. And then Ruby also just said it was a fabulous presentation, which I agree with 100%. You know, thank you, Ruby.
Thank you, Ruby. Yeah, and like I say, Beekeepers Guild of San Mateo County is an excellent resource for adults. If any of you have little ones at home, I do have actually, most of my videos are geared at little ones. So kind of, I have some bee projects on my website, and I actually have a lot of worksheets of like writing practice and learning about the casts. So if you've got little ones at home, honestly, like adults learn a lot from a lot of those activities as well, but you can give it to your little ones and learn along with them.
Excellent.
Great.
Yeah, I think we're good. And I also, you know, hearing your baby, your young one in the background, I want to make sure that we give you the opportunity to take care of that. But
luckily grandma's here. It's just like a beehive, it takes a village. Maybe not 60,000 village, but We've got some folks taking care of him.
It was so wonderful to have you here. If anyone has a burning question that you want to make sure you get answered, now's your time to do it. So please offer that. Did you have a questionnaire? Okay. And it was really great to have all of you here for this. I hope that you can take advantage of some of the library resources to learn more about beekeeping. If you wanted to get involved with it, I'm trying to remember if you said this in the presentation, I apologize, but right now is a really good time to start up your colony. If not, you might end up having to wait closer to a year to get started. Does that sound about right?
That is about right. And that's because right now we're kind of in bee breeding season. So a lot of local bee organizations have already started bringing in bees. So they took advanced reservations. That doesn't mean you're out of luck, because a lot of local beekeepers still sell bees, and it's easiest to breed them in the spring. But even here in the Bay Area, those drones, those boys that are required for mating, if it gets really hot and dry in the summer, they're also the lowest in the totem pole. All the girls will kick them out, and then we can't create queens here. So that's what, in the late summer, it actually gets really hard to create new beehives and sell people new beehives. So if you want to take this as an educational year, you can take some more time. But if you want to get started, now is the time, and contact the Beekeepers Guild right away, or your local store. Go to the Peninsula Feed store. Now's the right time. Great. Well, I think we've got all of the questions. If you think of anything else, I've got contact on my website. And like I say, local organizations are a great place to ask those questions too. And thanks everybody so much. I really appreciate you all coming and listening. I know I went a little over, but I wanted to answer all of your questions. So thanks so much.
No, you're great, Kendall. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, please take just a few minutes to rate this program. It really helps us figure out what to do in the future. And we hope you have a wonderful evening. Don't forget, you can celebrate poetry in just 15 minutes if you desire. But definitely get up and stretch and get around. Kendall, have a wonderful day. Everyone else as well too. A great evening. Thank you.